They said it would never happen, that a man as strong, as seasoned, and as spiritually commanding as Bishop T.D. Jakes would never be forced into the one conversation he spent years quietly outrunning, the one topic that clung to him like a shadow no sermon could shake off, no conference could drown out, and no applause could silence. And yet, as time passed, as he grew older and the weight of leadership pressed deeper into his soul, the whispers that once floated lightly in the background became loud enough to echo through sanctuaries, social media feeds, news blogs, and prayer circles until the entire world began to wonder how a man who preached truth so boldly could remain so painfully silent about the turmoil tied to his own family. For decades, T.D. Jakes stood unshaken, smiling through storms, traveling the world with the same powerful stride, building one of the largest ministries on earth, all while a private story grew behind his walls like a storm he refused to acknowledge, a truth he kept burying under sermons of healing, faith, restoration, and resilience, hoping perhaps that with enough time, enough distance, or enough spiritual noise, the world would stop asking questions. But destiny has a way of dragging buried truth back into the light. Now at 66, a man once known for unstoppable momentum had become quieter, more reflective, carrying a new kind of weight, not the weight of critics or fame or misplaced opinions, but the heavy, fragile, sacred weight of family, the weight that cracks even the strongest shoulders. Behind the dazzling stage lights of The Potter's House and the global audience that tuned in every week to hear his wisdom, there existed a private wound, a family struggle he desperately wished he could shield from the world's eyes. Before the rumors, before the headlines, before the confession that would shake even his most loyal supporters, T.D. Jakes had been nothing more than a young preacher in West Virginia with a borrowed suit, a beat-up car, and sermons so fiery that people could feel the ground shift beneath them. His following exploded, his books sold millions, his conferences became spiritual landmarks, and his image grew until people not only admired him, they expected his life and his entire family to be perfect. But the truth that made this story so heartbreaking was simple. It wasn't perfection that built the Jakes family, it was pressure. Relentless pressure. One of his daughters felt that pressure more intensely than anyone else. She smiled beside him in public, walked the carpets, showed up at events, and gave interviews, but privately she battled mistakes, emotions, and battles that every human being faces. Except in her case, every misstep became a headline, every rumor became content, and every private struggle was turned into a digital spectacle. At first, the rumors were quiet, scattered, ignorable, but like all whispers attached to a famous name, they grew louder, twisting through blogs and tabloids until a small spark of gossip became a wildfire of speculation. And through it all, T.D. Jakes remained completely silent. No statements, no clarifications, no defensive sermons. His silence, intended to protect, only fueled the frenzy. People began asking why a man known for addressing everything from marriage to pain to trauma refused to speak on the controversy circulating around his own household. Some believed he was hiding something. Others believed he was shielding his daughter, and many thought the truth was simply too painful for him to touch publicly. Inside the church, members whispered carefully, afraid to sound disrespectful. Outside the church, critics tore into him with boldness. Meanwhile, his daughter, fragile under the spotlight, felt herself drowning as the internet tore apart every mistake she ever made. Some rumors were exaggerated, others were flat-out lies, and some, painfully, held truth. She had never claimed perfection, but perfection was exactly what people demanded from the daughter of a global pastor. Behind closed doors, the family was breaking. They prayed together, cried together, battled the noise together, and yet every day the pressure intensified like a storm building on the horizon. T.D. Jakes, the man millions relied on for strength, suddenly found himself unable to fix the one storm destroying his own peace. He was torn between loyalty to his daughter and responsibility to his audience, torn between protecting her and maintaining the image the world projected onto him. For years he tried everything, long sermons, heartfelt reflections, motivational lessons, but nothing silenced the conversation that refused to die. Social media ignited with theories, arguments, and judgments. Some posts were cruel enough to wound a stranger, some were sympathetic, and others were disturbingly obsessive. People debated morality, leadership, fatherhood, and faith while his daughter carried pain the world would never fully understand. And through all this chaos, the media kept digging, reporting, speculating, reshaping the narrative. What began as quiet whispers had now turned into a global obsession, and for the first time in his lifetime of ministry, Bishop T.D. Jakes realized that this was a battle he could not avoid, a moment he could not preach past, a truth he could not outrun, because the storm had finally reached his front door, and the entire world was watching. They were relentless, circling like vultures hungry for the next headline, the next rumor, the next hint of confession, and no matter how much the Jakes family tried to fortify their privacy, the outside world kept digging deeper, forcing their personal pain into spotlight again and again until even the walls of their home felt thinner, echoing with the tension of a story that refused to stay buried. Inside the Jakes household, life looked nothing like the polished image people saw on television or in church broadcasts. Every day carried a heaviness that settled over the family like a thick fog, a blend of quiet heartbreak, unspoken fears, bruised trust, and emotional exhaustion. The daughter felt judgment pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't lift, while T.D. Jakes felt the sharp burden of trying to shield both his child and his calling from a world that showed no mercy. Friends whispered advice, advisors strategized, and church staff tried endlessly to guard the family from gossip, but none of those efforts could calm the storm building inside their home. Every conversation felt fragile, every prayer felt urgent, and every moment carried the potential to set off fresh waves of speculation. At some point, T.D. Jakes realized that silence, his trusted refuge, had become a liability, not a shield. He began wrestling with questions deeper than any sermon he had ever preached. What does leadership look like when your own home is breaking? What does fatherhood demand when the world is watching every step? Could he offer grace publicly without exposing his daughter to harsher scrutiny? Could he tell the truth without damaging the faith of millions who looked up to him as an anchor? These questions tortured him in the quiet hours of the night, creeping into his thoughts like shadows that would not let him rest. And then, like a slow sunrise before a storm, the answer formed. It was time. Time to confront the whispers, time to protect his daughter, and time to reclaim the narrative from the world that had twisted it beyond recognition. When the day came, he didn't appear with a scripted statement or a polished press release. Instead, he stepped into a softly lit room, sat before the camera, and let the weight of decades settle onto his shoulders. He spoke first about his children, the joys, the mistakes, the complicated journey of raising them under overwhelming expectations. His voice trembled as he described the heavy strain carried by his daughter, the pressure she endured, the wounds the public never saw, and the mistakes she made that the world refused to let go of. Then came the moment that shook everyone watching. A pause, a breath, a trembling vulnerability no one expected from a man known for towering strength. "I have carried these truths in silence for far too long," he said, his voice breaking with honesty. "My daughter is not perfect. None of us are, and she deserves love, support, and understanding, not judgment." His confession wasn't an excuse, it wasn't a defense, and it wasn't a public relations move. It was raw humanity. It was a father stepping out from behind the pulpit to protect his child with truth instead of silence. The reaction was immediate. The internet erupted. Supporters praised his courage and transparency. Critics questioned his timing. Commentators debated the implications for his ministry, his legacy, and the blurred line between spiritual leadership and personal vulnerability. Meanwhile, inside the Jakes home, a complicated mix of relief and fear washed over the daughter. Her father had finally spoken, finally acknowledged her pain, finally stood between her and the brutal gaze of the world. But now, every detail of her life was under a sharper microscope, every action subject to even more intense scrutiny. The family suddenly realized that honesty had opened a door that could never be closed. Every choice they made would now be watched, discussed, and dissected. Every step forward would be shadowed by questions, speculation, and public reaction. Even as T.D. Jakes tried to shift the conversation toward grace, forgiveness, and humanity, he knew he had invited a new kind of pressure, one that demanded strength on a level he had never faced. The confession wasn't closure. It wasn't a clean ending. It was the beginning of a deeper, more tangled narrative that the world was already preparing to follow with obsessive interest. It was the moment a spiritual giant looked into the camera, not as a bishop, not as an icon, but as a father who could no longer hide behind silence. And as reactions flooded the world, some loving, some cruel, it became undeniable that this single confession had cracked open a story far bigger, far messier, and far more human than anyone ever imagined. He spoke about leadership, responsibility, and the immense human cost of living under public scrutiny, reminding the world that the stories people see online, in tabloids, and across social media are often fragments of truth wrapped in sensationalism, rarely reflecting the depths of struggle, love, pain, and resilience behind closed doors. The craziest part is how he managed to turn what many expected to explode into scandal into something far more profound. A lesson in compassion, perspective, and grace. By acknowledging what others would have hidden, he invited people everywhere to rethink how they judge, how they empathize, and how they forgive. His words, trembling with emotion yet firm with conviction, were not simply about his daughter, they became a mirror held up to the entire world, confronting the way people treat imperfection, struggle, and humanity itself. And as the days passed, the ripple effects of his confession continued growing like waves rolling off a storm. News outlets dissected every sentence, commentators debated intentions and timing, and online discussions grew more intense. Some people felt inspired to face their own family battles, others wondered whether his delayed honesty strengthened or weakened his credibility. Meanwhile, inside the Jakes household, a completely different story was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with headlines but everything to do with healing. Long conversations stretched late into the night, raw emotions spilled into family counseling, and years of bottled-up pain began to release in slow, trembling confessions. This is how the private life of a global spiritual leader became a lesson not just in faith, but in human resilience, family responsibility, and the unspoken weight leaders carry when their private wounds become public entertainment. And even with love, empathy, and support rising around him, criticism still lingered. Some questioned why he waited so long, others called the confession strategic rather than sincere, but he kept his gaze fixed on what mattered most. His daughter. He spent hour after hour guiding her, comforting her, teaching her that mistakes do not erase value, they deepen it. Their family slowly realized that the confession wasn't an ending, it was a turning point, a crack through which light could finally enter the parts of their hearts that had been locked away by years of fear, shame, and silence. What made this story so radically different was the choice he made. Most public figures would have remained quiet, issued a statement through a representative, or denied everything. But he chose truth, he chose transparency, he chose the harder path, and through that choice, he revealed a level of humanity rarely seen in the public eye. Even as online reactions raged, supportive, critical, confused, hopeful, inside the home, the story softened into something intimate and painfully real. The daughter began to truly process her father's words, understanding the love behind them and the vulnerability that came with such a public confession. Friends close to the family noticed how conversations grew raw and honest, breaking open emotions that had been buried for years beneath expectations and fear of judgment. Counseling sessions became sacred spaces. Shared prayers carried greater weight. Each late-night talk carved out more room for healing. Destiny had taken an unexpected turn, a turn no one could have predicted when the first whisper emerged years earlier. Even after the confession echoed across the world, the story didn't fade into silence. It grew more layered, more human, more meaningful. Social media buzzed with speculation, news outlets continued their analysis, and fans and critics alike waited to see what would happen next. But within the Jakes family, something beautiful began to form. For the first time, the daughter felt genuinely seen, not as a character in rumors or a subject in gossip, but as a human being navigating private struggles beneath the crushing weight of public expectations. Her father's words had carved out space for her healing, even if the world was still watching. And here's the twist no one expected. The very moment that many feared would tear the family apart became the doorway to deeper connection, understanding, and emotional honesty. T.D. Jakes began sharing reflections on imperfection, the burden of visibility, and the responsibilities of both leadership and parenthood in ways he never had before. He reminded the world that every revered figure has wounds, that every leader has limits, and that behind every powerful sermon is a person learning, breaking, healing, and trying again. He turned a moment of vulnerability into a message of hope, showing that transparency doesn't weaken leadership, it strengthens it. Inside the Potter's house, the congregation felt the effects. Some wondered if the confession had shaken his authority, while others said it made his leadership more authentic than ever. Staff members began to see their pastor through a lens of shared humanity, recognizing that grace isn't just preached, it must be lived, especially under intense scrutiny. What started as a family struggle turned into a nationwide conversation about judgment, morality, and authenticity. And even as the world continued to analyze, criticize, or celebrate the confession, the Jakes family focused on rebuilding through love, counseling, forgiveness, and the strength to face truth together. Every day, they learned how to live in the tension between public responsibility and private healing. What makes this story so powerful is that it wasn't just about a confession. It was about the courage to be imperfect, the bravery to tell the truth, and the love that held a family together through a storm that could have destroyed them. As the dust settled, people saw T.D. Jakes in a new light, not just as a preacher or spiritual icon, but as a father, a man who carried hidden burdens and chose vulnerability over silence. And his daughter, once a whisper in the wind of public speculation, emerged with her own identity, her own voice, her own story. no longer a headline, but a human being worthy of grace, dignity, and understanding. In the end, what could have become a scandal transformed into a testament of truth, family, and the extraordinary resilience of the human heart. The world may continue to speculate, but one thing became undeniable. The Jakes family endured the storm, learned from it, and rose with a deeper understanding of faith, love, and the quiet power of being real.